The old dilapidated palazzo into which they had moved supplied Vronsky with the agreeable illusion that he was not so much a Russian proprietor, a stallmeister, in retirement, as he was an enlightened amateur and protector of art, in his own modest way an artist, who had sacrificed society, his ties, his ambition, for a woman's love. This ancient palace, with its lofty stuccoed ceilings, its frescoed walls, its mosaic floors, its yellow tapestries, its thick yellow curtains at the high windows, its vases on mantelpiece and consoles, its carved doors, and its melancholy halls hung with paintings, lent itself readily to this illusion. This new rôle which Vronsky had chosen, together with their removal to the palazzo and acquaintance with several interesting persons, which came about through Golenishtchev, made the first part of this period very enjoyable. Under the instruction of an Italian professor of painting, he made some studies from nature, and he took up the study of Italian life during the Middle Ages. The medieval Italian life became so fascinating to him that he began to wear his hat and throw his plaid over his shoulders in the medieval style, which was very becoming to him. "Here we are alive, and yet we know nothing," said Vronsky one morning to Golenishtchev, who came in to see him. "Have you seen Mikhailov's painting?" he asked, and at the same time handed him a Russian paper just received, and indicated an article on this artist, who was living in that very city and had just completed a picture about which many reports had long been in circulation, and which had been sold on the easel. The article severely criticized the government and the academy that an artist of such genius was left without any encouragement and aid. "I have seen it," replied Golenishtchev. "Of course he is not without talent, but his tendencies are absolutely false. He always shows the Ivanov Strass raisin concept of Christ and religious art." "What is the subject of his painting?" asked Anna. "Christ before Pilate. The Christ is a Jew with all the realism of the new school." And as this subject was a favorite one with him, he began to develop his ideas. "I cannot understand how they can fall into such a gross mistake. The type of the Christ in art was clearly represented by the old masters. Accordingly, if they want to paint not God, but a sage or a revolutionist, let them take Franklin or Socrates or Charlotte Corday, but not Christ. They take the very person whom art should not attempt to portray, and then—" "Is it true that this Mikhailoff is in such poverty?" asked Vronsky, who felt that in his quality of Russian Maecenas he ought to find some way of aiding the artist, whether his painting was good or not. "It is doubtful. He is a famous portrait painter. Have you not seen his portrait of Madame Vassiltchikov? But it seems he doesn't care to paint portraits any longer, and perhaps that is the reason he is in need. I say that— Couldn't we ask him to paint Anna Arkadyevna's portrait?" "Why mine?" she demanded. "After your portrait of me, I want no other. It would be better to let him paint Annie," so she called her daughter, "or her," she added, looking out of the window at the pretty Italian nurse who was just taking the baby into the garden. And at the same time she gave Vronsky a furtive glance. This pretty Italian woman, whose face Vronsky had taken as a model for a picture, was the only secret woe in Anna's life. Vronsky painted her picture, admired her beauty and her medieval qualities, and Anna did not dare to confess to herself that she feared she was going to be jealous, and was accordingly all the more kind to her and her little boy. Vronsky also looked out of the window, and at Anna's eyes, and instantly turning to Golenishtchev, said, "And so you know this Mikhailoff?" "I have met him, but he is an original, a chudak, without any education, you know, one of these new-fashioned savages such as you meet with nowadays. You know them, these free thinkers, who rush headlong into atheism, materialism, universal negation. Once," Golenishtchev went on to say, either not noticing or not wishing to notice that both Vronsky and Anna were ready to speak, "once the free thinker was a man educated in the concepts of religion, law, and morality, who did not ignore the laws by which society is regulated, and who reached freedom of thought only after long struggles. But now we have a new type of them, free thinkers who grow up without even knowing that there are such things as laws in morality and religion, who will not admit that such authorities exist, and who possess only the sentiment of negation. In a word, savages. Michailoff is one of these. He is the son of a major domo, or oberlakai, at Moscow, and never had any education. When he entered the academy, and made a reputation, he was willing to be taught, for he is not a fool. And, with this end in view, he turned to that source of all learning, the magazines and reviews. Now you know in the good old times, if a man, let us say a Frenchman, wanted to get an education, he would study the classics. The preachers, the tragic poets, the historians, the philosophers, and you can see all the intellectual labor that involved. But nowadays he turns to negative literature, and succeeds very speedily in getting a smattering of such a science. And, again, 20 years ago, he would have found in this same literature traces of the struggle against the authorities and secular traditions of the past. He would have understood from this dispute that there was something else. But now he turns directly to a literature where the old traditions are of no avail at all, but men say up and down there is nothing, natural selection, evolution, struggle for existence, negation, and all. In my article—" "Do you know," said Anna, after exchanging several glances with Vronsky, and noticing that he was not interested in the artist's education, but was occupied only with the thought of helping him, and getting him to paint the portrait. "What do you say?" said she, resolutely cutting short Golenishtchev's verbiage. "Let us go and see him." Golenishtchev, after deliberating, readily consented, and, as the artist lived in a remote quarter, they had a carriage called. An hour later, Anna, occupying the same seat in the calash with Golenishtchev and Vronsky, drove up to an ugly new house in a distant part of the city. When they learned from the concierge's wife, who came to receive them, that Michailoff permitted visitors to his studio, but that he was now at his lodgings a few steps distant, they sent her to him with their cards, and begged to be admitted to see his paintings. The painter Michailoff was at work as usual, when the cards of Count Vronsky and Golenishtchev were brought to him. He had been painting all the morning in his studio on his great picture, but, when he reached his house, he became enraged with his wife because of her failure to make terms with their landlady, who demanded money. "I have told you 20 times not to go into explanations with her. You are a fool anyway, but when you try to argue in Italian, you are 3 times as much of a fool," said he, at the end of a long dispute. "Why do you get behindhand so? It is not my fault. If I had any money—" "For heaven's sake, give me some peace!" cried Michailoff, his voice thick with tears, and, putting his hands over his ears, he hastily rushed to the workroom, separated from the sitting-room by a partition, and bolted the door. "She hasn't any common sense," he said to himself, as he sat down at his table, and, opening a portfolio, addressed himself with feverish ardor to a sketch which he had already begun. He never worked with such zeal and success as when his life went hard, and especially when he had been quarreling with his wife. "Ah, it must be somewhere," he said to himself, as he went on with his work. He had begun a study of a man seized with a fit of anger. He had made the sketch some time before, but he was dissatisfied with it. "No," said he, "that one was better. But where is it?" He went back to his wife with an air of vexation, and, without looking at her, asked his eldest daughter for the piece of paper which he had given her. The paper with the sketch on it was found, but it was soiled and covered with drops of tallow. Nevertheless, he took it as it was, laid it on the table, examined it from a distance, squinting his eyes, then suddenly he smiled, with a satisfied gesture. "So, so!" he cried, taking a pencil and drawing some rapid lines. One of the tallow spots gave his sketch a new aspect. He sketched in this new pose, and suddenly remembered the prominent chin and energetic face of the man of whom he bought his cigars, and instantly he gave his design the same kind of a face and prominent chin. He laughed with delight. The figure ceased to be something vague and dead, but became animated, and took a form which could not be bettered. This figure was alive, and was clearly and indubitably delineated. It was possible to correct the sketch in conformity with the demands of this figure. It was possible and even requisite to set the legs in a different way, to make an absolute change in the position of the left arm, to rearrange the hair. But after he had finished these corrections he made no changes in the figure, but only cleared away what concealed it. He, as it were, took from it the veils behind which it was not wholly visible. Each new stroke only the more exposed the entire figure in all its energetic power, just as it had suddenly appeared to him in the spot made by the wax. He laughed with delight. He was carefully finishing his design when the 2 cards were brought to him. "I will come instantly," he replied. He went to his wife. "There, come, Sasha, don't be vexed," he said with a smile tender and timid. "You were wrong, so was I. I will settle matters." And, having made his peace with her, he put on an olive green overcoat with velvet collar, took his hat, and went to his studio. His successfully completed sketch was already quite forgotten. Now he was delighted and surprised by the visit of these stylish Russians, who had come to see him in a carriage. In the depth of his soul his opinion on the painting which was on his easel at that time was as follows: "No one has ever painted another like it." He did not believe that his painting was better than all the Raphaels, but he knew that no one had ever put into a picture what he had tried to put into this one. This he knew assuredly, and had known it ever since he had begun to paint it. Nevertheless, the criticisms of others, whatever they were, possessed for him an enormous weight and stirred him to the depths of his soul. Any remark, however insignificant, which showed that the critic saw even the smallest part of what he himself saw in this picture, stirred him to the depths of his soul. He felt that his critics had a depth of insight superior even to his own, and he expected to have them discover in his picture new features that had escaped his own observation. And often in the judgments of visitors who came to look at it, it seemed to him he discovered this. He hurried to the door of his studio, and, in spite of his emotion, was struck by the soft radiance of Anna, who was standing in the shadow of the portico and listening to something which Golenishev was saying to her, and at the same time eagerly watching the artist's approach. The artist, without definite consciousness of it, instantly stowed away in the pigeonholes of his brain the impression she had made on him, to make use of it some day, just as he had used the tobacconist's chin. The visitors, whose ideas of Mikhailoff had been greatly modified by Golenishev's description of him, were still more disenchanted when they saw him. Mikhailoff was a thick-set man of medium height and with a nimble gait, and in his cinnamon-colored hat, his olive-green coat, and his trousers worn tight when the style was to wear them loose, produced an unfavorable impression, increased by the vulgarity of his broad face and the mixture of timidity and pretentious dignity which it expressed. "Do me the honor to enter," he said, trying to assume an air of indifference, and, going to the vestibule, he took a key out of his pocket and opened the door. As they entered the studio, Mikhailoff again glanced at his guests, and stored away in his memory the expression of Vronsky's face, especially its cheekbones. Notwithstanding the fact that this man's artistic sense was always at work storing up new materials, notwithstanding the fact that his emotion grew greater and greater as the crucial moment for their criticism of his work approached, still he quickly and shrewdly gathered from almost imperceptible indications his conclusions regarding his 3 visitors. "That one," meeting Golenishev, "must be a Russian resident in Italy." Mikhailoff did not remember either his name or the place where he had met him, or whether he had ever spoken to him. He remembered only his face, as he remembered all the faces that he had ever seen. But he also remembered that he had once before classed him in the immense category of pretentiously important, but really expressionless faces. An abundance of hair and a very high forehead would make the casual observer take him to be a man of importance. But his face had an insignificant expression of puerile agitation concentrated in the narrow space between his eyes. Vronsky and Anna were, according to Mikhailoff's intuition, rich and distinguished Russians, ignorant of art, like all rich Russians who play amateur and the connoisseur. "They have undoubtedly seen all the old galleries," he thought, "and now are visiting the studios of the German charlatans and the imbecile English pre-Raphaelites, and have come to me in order to complete their survey." He knew very well the fashion in which the dilettanti, the more intellectual they were, the worse they were, visited the studios of modern painters, with the single aim of having the right to say that art was declining, and that, the more you study the moderns, the better you see how inimitable the great masters of old were. He expected all this. He saw it in their faces, and he read it in the indifference with which his visitors conversed together as they walked up and down the studio, leisurely examining the mannequins and busts, while waiting for him to take the covering off his painting. But, in spite of this, all the time that he was turning over his studies, raising his window blinds, and uncovering his paintings, he experienced a powerful emotion, all the more so because, though he considered that all distinguished and wealthy Russians must necessarily be cattle and fools, yet Vronsky, and particularly Anna, pleased him. "Here," he said, stepping back from the easel and pointing to the painting, "is the Christ before Pilate, Matthew, chapter 27. He felt his lips tremble with emotion, and he took his place behind his guests. During the few seconds during which the visitors looked silently at the painting, Mihailov also looked at it, and looked at it with the indifference of a stranger. In those few seconds he anticipated a superior and infallible criticism from these three persons, whom but a moment before he had despised. He forgot all that he had thought about his painting during the 3 years while he had been painting it. He forgot all those merits which had been so indubitable to him. He looked at it now with the cold and critical look of a stranger, and found nothing good in it. He saw in the foreground the irate face of Pilate and the Christ's serene countenance, and in the middle distance the figures of Pilate's servants, and among them John, looking on at the proceedings. Each face, with its attempted expression, with its faults, with its recidifications, each face which, with its own peculiar character, had, as it were, been a growth from himself, and had cost him so much travail and delight, and all these faces, which he had changed so many times so as to unify them, all the shades of color, all the nuances obtained with such extraordinary pains, all this, taken together and looked at in such a way, now seemed to him commonplace, 1,000-fold commonplace. The face which he had regarded with the most complacency, the face of the Christ in the very center of the picture, which had roused his enthusiasm as he had developed it, was wholly spoilt for him when he looked at his painting with their eyes. He saw a well-painted picture, nay, not even well-painted, for now he clearly detected hosts of faults in it, a repetition of all those interminable Christs of Titian, Raphael, Rubens, and all the same soldiers and Pilate. All about it was trivial, poor, and antiquated, and even badly painted, spotty and feeble. They would be justified in repeating politely hypocritical remarks in his presence, pitying him and ridiculing him after they were gone. The silence, which in reality did not last more than a minute, seemed to him intolerably long, and to abridge it and show that he was not agitated, he made an effort and addressed Golenishev. "I think that I have had the honor of meeting you before," said he, glancing anxiously first at Anna, then at Vronsky, so that he might not lose for an instant the changing expression of their faces. "Certainly. We met at Rossi's the evening when that Italian girl, the new Rachel, made a recitation. Don't you remember?" replied Golenishev, turning away his face from the picture without the least show of regret, and addressing the artist. Seeing, however, that Mihailov was expecting him to say something about the picture, he added, "Your work has made great progress since the last time I saw it, and I am now, just as I was then, greatly impressed with your Pilate. You have represented a good but feeble man, a chinovnik to the bottom of his soul, who is absolutely blind to what he is doing. But it seems to me—" Mihailov's mobile face suddenly lighted up, his eyes gleamed, he wanted to reply, but his emotion prevented him, and he pretended to have a fit of coughing. In spite of his low estimation of Golenishev's artistic instinct, in spite of the insignificance of the remark, true though it was, about the expression of Pilate's face represented in the face of a functionary, in spite of the humiliation which such a remark spontaneously elicited at the first sight of the painting, implicitly subjected him to, since the more important features of the painting were left unnoticed, Mihailov was in raptures over this criticism. Golenishev had expressed his own conception of Pilate. The fact that this observation was one out of a million possible observations, all of which, as Mihailov knew perfectly well, would be true, did not diminish for him the significance of Golenishtchev's remark. He suddenly conceived a liking for his guest, and suddenly flew from dejection to enthusiasm. Instantly his whole painting became vital once more with a life inexpressibly complex and profound. He again tried to say that he himself had that conception of Pilate, but his lips trembled so that he had no control over them, and he could not say a word. Vronsky and Anna were talking in that low tone of voice peculiar to picture exhibitions, and caused by the desire not to say anything that might give offense to the artist, and, more than all, not to let anyone hear those absurd remarks which are so easily made in regard to art. Mihailov thought that his picture was making an impression on them also, and he approached them. "What an admirable expression the Christ has," said Anna. This expression pleased her more than anything else in the painting, and she felt that the Christ was the principal figure in it, and therefore that this eulogy would be agreeable to the artist. She added, "One can see that he pities Pilate." This, again, was one of those million accurate but idle observations which his picture, and especially the figure of Christ, might have elicited. She said that Christ pitied Pilate. In the expression of the Christ there was bound to be an expression of pity, because there was in it the expression of love, a supernal color, a readiness for death, and a realization of the idleness of words. Of course, Pilate should stand for the functionary, the chinovnik, and the Christ should show pity for him, since one is the incarnation of the fleshly life, the other of the spiritual life. All this and much besides flashed through Mikhailov's mind, and once more his face was radiant with joy. "Yes, and how that figure is painted! How much atmosphere! One could go round it," said Golenishtchev, evidently showing by this observation that he did not approve of the design and scope of the figure. "Yes, it is a wonderful masterpiece," said Vronsky. "How alive those figures in the background are! There is technique for you," he added, turning to Golenishtchev, and alluding to a discussion in which he had avowed his discouragement in the technique of the art. "Yes, yes, very remarkable," said Golenishtchev and Anna simultaneously. Notwithstanding the condition of enthusiasm to which he had risen, the remark about technique nettled Mihailov. He scowled and looked at Vronsky with an angry expression. He had often heard this word technique, and he really did not know what was meant by it. He knew that this word signified the mechanical ability to paint and sketch, and had nothing to do with the thing painted. He had often noticed, as in the present case, that technical skill was opposed to the intrinsic merit of a work, as if it were possible to paint a bad picture with talent. He knew that it required great attention and care in removing the cloth not to injure the work, and in removing all the covers. But the technique of painting was not in that. If in the same way to a little child or to his cook were revealed what he saw, then the cook or the child would not hesitate to express what they saw. But the most experienced and skillful of technicians could not paint anything by mechanical ability only. It requires that the realm of inspiration should be opened before him. Moreover, he saw that the very fact of talking about technique made it impossible to praise him for it. In everything that he had painted and was painting, he saw the glaring faults resulting from the carelessness with which he had removed the covers, faults impossible now to rectify without ruining the whole production. And in almost all the figures and faces he saw the remains of veils that had not been perfectly removed, and spoiled the painting. "The only criticism that I should dare to make, if you will allow me," said Golenishtchev. "Oh, I should be very glad. Beg you to favor me," replied Mihailov, pretending to smile. "Is that you have painted a man made God, and not God made man. However, I know that that was your intention." "I cannot paint any Christ that is not in my heart," replied Mihailov gloomily. "Yes, but in that case, excuse me, if you will allow me to express my thought, your painting is so beautiful that this observation can do it no harm, and, besides, it is my own individual opinion. You look on this in one way. Your very motive is peculiar. Take Ivanov, for example. I imagine that if the Christ is to be reduced to the proportions of a historical figure, then it would be better for him to choose a new historical theme, one less hackneyed." "But suppose this theme is the grandest of all for art?" By searching, others may be found, just as grand. But the fact is, art, in my estimation, cannot suffer discussion. Now this question is raised in the minds of believers or non-believers by Ivanov's painting. Is that God or not God? And thus the unity of the impression is destroyed. Why so? It seems to me that this question can no longer exist for enlightened men, replied Michailov. Golenishev was not of this opinion, and, dwelling on his first thought about the unity of the impression required by art, he made an onslaught on Michailov. Michailov grew excited, but could not say anything in defense of his ideas. Anna and Vronsky, weary of their friend's learned loquacity, exchanged glances. Finally Vronsky, without saying anything to his host, went over to a small painting. "Oh, how charming! What a gem! Wonderful! How fascinating!" said both of them at once. What pleases them so, thought Michailov. He had completely forgotten this picture, painted 3 years before. He had forgotten all the anguish and joy which that painting had caused him while he had been working at it day and night for days at a time. He had forgotten about it as he always forgot about his pictures when once they were finished. He did not even like to look at it, and he had brought it out only because he was expecting an Englishman who had thought of purchasing it. "That is nothing," he said, "only a study." "But it is capital," replied Golenishev, very honestly, falling under the charm of the painting. 2 children were fishing under the shade of a laburnum. The elder, all absorbed in his work, was cautiously disentangling his float from a bush. The younger one was lying in the grass, leaning his blond, frowsy head on his hand, and gazing at the water with great, pensive blue eyes. What was he thinking about? The enthusiasm caused by this study brought back somewhat of Mikhailov's first emotion, but he did not love the vain memories of the past, and, therefore, pleasant as such praise was to him, he preferred to take his guests to a third painting. But Vronsky asked him if the painting was for sale. But to Michailov, who was excited by the presence of visitors, the question of money was very distasteful. "It was put up for sale," said he, darkly frowning. After his visitors had gone, Michailov sat down before his painting of Christ and Pilate, and mentally reviewed all that had been said, and if not said had been understood by them. And how strange! The observations which seemed so weighty when they were present, and when he put himself on their plane of observation, now lost all significance. He began to examine his work with his artist's eye, and soon regained his full conviction of its perfection and significance, so that he could shut out all other interests and make the effort necessary for his best work. The foreshortening in the leg of the Christ was not quite correct. He seized his palette and set himself to work, and, while he was correcting it, looked long at the figure of John, which seemed to him to show the highest degree of perfection, and yet his visitors had not even noticed it. Having corrected the leg of Christ, he tried to give this also a few touches, but he felt too excited to do it. However, he could not work when he was cool any better than he could when he was too near the melting point or when he was too clairvoyant. It was only one stop of transition from indifference to inspiration, and only when he reached this was work possible. But today he was too excited. He started to cover the canvas. Then he stopped, lifting the drapery with one hand, and smiled ecstatically, and looked for a long time at his St. John. At last, tearing himself from his contemplation, he let the curtain fall and went home, weary but happy. Vronsky, Anna, and Golenishev, returning to the palazzo, were very lively and gay. They talked about Michailov and his paintings. The word talent was often heard as they talked. They meant by it an innate gift, almost physical, independent of intellect and heart, and they tried to express it by all that had been experienced by the artist. It seemed as if they needed to have a term which should express something of which they had not the slightest comprehension, but yet wanted to talk about. There is no denying his talent, they said, but his talent is not sufficiently developed because he lacks intellectual culture, a fault common to all Russian artists. But the painting of the 2 boys appealed to their tastes, and again they recurred to it. How charming, how natural and how simple! And he did not realize how good it was. Certainly I must not fail to buy it, said Vronsky. Mikhailoff sold Vronsky the little picture, and also agreed to paint Anna's portrait. He came on the appointed day and began his work. Even on the fifth sitting the portrait struck everyone, and especially Vronsky, by its resemblance and by its peculiar beauty. It was remarkable how Mikhailoff was able to hit upon her peculiar beauty. One must know her and love her as I love her to get her gentle and spiritual expression, thought Vronsky. And yet he found in Mikhailoff's portrait exactly that expression. But this expression was so faithful that it seemed to him and to others that they had always known it. "I have spent so much time and never get ahead," said Vronsky, referring to his own portrait of Anna. "And he has only to look at her to paint her. That is what I call technique." "That will come," said Golenishev, to console him, for in his eyes Vronsky had talent, and, moreover, had a training which ought to give him a lofty view of art. But Golenishev's belief in Vronsky's talent was sustained by the fact that he needed Vronsky's praise and sympathy with him in his own work, and he felt that the praise and support ought to be reciprocal. It was a fair exchange. In a stranger's house, and especially in Vronsky's palazzo, Mikhailoff was an entirely different man from what he was in his own studio. He showed himself almost venomously respectful, as if he were anxious to avoid all intimacy with people whom at heart he did not respect. He always called Vronsky "Your Excellency," and in spite of Vronsky's and Anna's repeated invitations, he never would stay to dinner, or come except at the hours for the sitting. Anna was even more genial to him than to the others, and grateful for her portrait. Vronsky was more than polite to him, and was anxious for his criticism on his paintings. Golenishev never lost an opportunity of inculcating sound theories of art. Still Mikhailoff remained just as cool as ever to them all. But Anna felt that he liked to look at her, even though he avoided all conversation with her. When Vronsky wanted to talk about his own work he remained obstinately silent, and he was just as obstinately silent when he was shown Vronsky's painting and pictures, and he took no pains to conceal the weariness which Golenishev's sermons caused him. On the whole, Mikhailoff, by his distant and disagreeable, as it were hostile, behavior, was very unpopular with them, even after they came to see him closer, and they were glad when the sittings were over, and the painter, having completed an admirable portrait, ceased to come. Golenishev was the first to express a thought which all had been thinking, that Mikhailoff was envious of Vronsky. "We will agree that he is not envious because he has talent, but he is vexed to see a wealthy man of high position, a count, and apparently they are all vexed at that, reaching without especial trouble the skill to paint as well, if not better, than he, though he has devoted his life to painting, but above all at your mental culture, which he has not." Vronsky took Mikhailoff's part, but he felt at heart that his friend was right, for it seemed to him extremely natural that a man in an inferior position should envy him. The two portraits of Anna, painted from life by him and Mikhailoff, might have shown Vronsky the difference between him and Mikhailoff, but he did not see it. Only after Mikhailoff had finished his portrait, he ceased to work at his, having decided it was a superfluity, but he still devoted himself to his painting of medieval life. He himself, and Golenishev, and Anna especially, felt that it was very good, because it resembled the works of the old masters far more than Mikhailoff's painting did. Mikhailoff, meantime, in spite of the pleasure which he took in doing Anna's portrait, was even more glad than the others were when the sittings came to an end, and he no longer had to hear Golenishev's discourses about art, and he was allowed to forget Vronsky's paintings. He knew that it was impossible to prevent Vronsky from amusing himself with painting. He knew that he, and all other dilettanti, had the right to paint as much as they pleased, but it was disagreeable to him. No one can prevent a man from making for himself a big wax doll and kissing it, but if this man takes his doll and sits it in the presence of a lover and begins to caress his doll as the lover caresses the woman he loves, then it becomes unpleasant to the lover. Vronsky's painting produced on him a similar feeling. It was ridiculous and vexatious, pitiable and disgusting. Vronsky's enthusiasm for painting and the Middle Ages was, however, of short duration. His art instinct was strong enough to prevent him from finishing his painting. His work came to a standstill. He had a dim consciousness that his faults, at first apparently trifling, would grow more and more grievous if he went on. The same thing happened to him that happened to Golenishev, who was conscious that he had nothing to say, and kept deceiving himself with the notion that his thought was not yet ripe, that he was training it and collecting materials. But this made Golenishev bitter and irritable, while Vronsky could not deceive himself, or torture himself, and, least of all, grow irritable. With his habitual decision of character, without speaking to justify himself or to offer explanations, he simply gave up his painting. But, without this occupation, his life in this little Italian city quickly became intolerable. The palazzo suddenly appeared old and filthy. The spots on the curtains assumed a sordid aspect. The cracks in the mosaics, the broken stucco of the cornices, the eternal Golenishev, the Italian professor, and the German tourist, all became so unspeakably wearisome that it was necessary to make a change. Accordingly he and Anna, who was surprised by this abrupt disenchantment, decided to return to Russia to live in the country. Vronsky wanted to pass through Petersburg to make business arrangements with his brother, and Anna was anxious to see her son. They decided to spend the summer on Vronsky's large patrimonial estate. Levin had been married 3 months. He was happy, but in a different way from what he had anticipated. At every step he had found that his former expectations were illusory, and that his joy lay in what he had not anticipated. He was happy, but as he went on in his married existence he discovered at each step that it was utterly different from what he had imagined it would be. At each step he experienced what a man would experience who had been charmed with the graceful and joyful motion of a boat on the sea, and afterwards should find himself in the boat. He saw that it was not enough to sit still and not rock. It was necessary to be on the lookout, never for a moment forgetful of the course, to think of the water under his feet, to row, and rowing for unaccustomed arms is hard. Easy enough it is to look on, but it is hard, very hard, to work, even though it be very agreeable. When still a bachelor, looking at the conjugal life of others, at their little miseries, quarrels, jealousies, he had often laughed scornfully in his heart of hearts. In his future married life never should any such thing happen. Even all the external forms of his private life should be in every respect absolutely different from that of others. And lo and behold, instead of that, his life with his wife not only refused to arrange itself peculiarly, but, on the contrary, was wholly made up of those very same insignificant trifles which he had formerly so despised, but which now, in spite of him, assumed an extraordinary and irrefutable importance. And Levin saw that the regulation of all these trifles was not nearly so easy as he had supposed it would be. Notwithstanding the fact that Levin supposed he had the most delicate comprehension of family life, he, like all men, had imagined that it was only meant as the gratification of his love, and that nothing should prevent it, and that no petty details ought to interfere with it. According to his idea, he was to do his work and rest from it in the delights of love. His wife was to be his love, and that was all. But, like all men, he forgot that she, too, had to work. His surprise was great to find how this charming and poetic Kitty, in the first weeks, even in the first days of their married life, could be thinking, planning, taking charge of the tablecloths, the furniture, the mattresses, the table service, the kitchen. Even during their engagement, he was dumbfounded at the decided way in which she refused to travel abroad, and at her determination to go immediately to their country home, as if she knew what was needful, and could think of other things besides her love. It vexed him then, and now many times he still felt vexed, to find that she took upon herself these petty cares and labors. But he saw that it was unavoidable, and, as he loved her, although he could not see why she did such things, and although he laughed at her for doing them, he could not help admiring. He laughed to see how she disposed of the new furniture which came from Moscow, how she rearranged everything in her room and his, how she hung the curtains, provided for the guest rooms and the rooms that Dolly would have, directed her new chambermaid, how she ordered the old cook to provide for dinner, how she discussed with Agafya Mikhailovna, whom she removed from the charge of the provisions. He saw how the old cook smiled gently as he received fantastic orders, impossible to execute. He saw how Agafya Mikhailovna shook her head pensively at the new measures introduced by her young mistress into the larder. He saw how wonderfully charming she was when she came to him, half laughing, half crying, to complain because her maid, Masha, insisted on treating her like a child, and no one would heed her orders. It all seemed to him charming, but strange, and he thought it would be better if it were otherwise. He could not comprehend the sense of metamorphosis which she felt at finding herself the mistress, permitted to see the preparation of cauliflower and kvass or confections, to spend all the money she wanted, and to command whatever pastry she pleased, after having always had her parents to restrain her fancies. She was now making joyful preparations for the arrival of Dolly and the children, and was thinking of the pies which she would have made for them, and how she would surprise Dolly with all her new arrangements. She herself could not have given any reasons for it, but it was a fact that the details of housekeeping had an irresistible attraction for her. She foresaw evil days to come, instinctively feeling the approach of spring, and knowing that unhappy days would also surely come. She prepared her little nest as well as she could, and made haste both to build it and to learn how to build it. This zeal for trifles, so entirely opposed to Levin's lofty ideal of happiness, seemed to him one thing that disillusioned him, while the same activity, the meaning of which escaped him, but which he could not help loving, was one of the things that gave him new delight. The quarrels were also a disenchantment and a charm. Never had it entered into Levin's head that between him and his wife there could be any relations other than those of gentleness, respect, tenderness, and here, even in their honeymoon, they were disputing, so that Kitty declared that he did not love her, that he was selfish, and burst into tears and wrung her hands. The first of these little differences arose in consequence of a ride which Levin took to see a new farm. He stayed half an hour longer than he had said, having missed his way in trying to come home by a shorter road. He rode homeward, thinking only of her love, of her happiness, and the nearer he came to the house, the more his heart glowed with affection for his wife. He hurried to her room with the same feeling, only much intensified, as he had experienced on the day when he went to the Shtcherbatskys' to offer himself. An angry expression, such as he had never seen in her face, received him. He was going to kiss her. She pushed him away. "What is the matter?" "You've been enjoying," she began, wishing to show herself cold and bitter. But hardly had she opened her mouth when the ridiculous jealousy, which had been tormenting her for half an hour while she had been waiting for him, sitting on the window-seat, broke out in a torrent of angry words. He then began for the first time to understand clearly what before he had seen only confusedly, when after the crowning they went out of the church. He saw that she was not only near to him, but that he did not know at all where his personality began or her personality ended. He felt this by the painful sensation of internal division which he experienced at that instant. At first he was offended, but at the same moment he realized that he had no right to be offended, because she and he were one and the same. At that first instant he experienced a feeling such as a man might have when, having suddenly received a sharp blow from behind, turns around with an angry desire to revenge himself on the culprit, and discovers that he has accidentally inflicted the blow on himself, and that there is no one to be angry with, and that he must bear the pain and appease it. Never again did he experience this feeling with such force, but this first time it was long before he could give an account of it. A natural impulse impelled him to exonerate himself, and show Kitty how wrong she was, but that would have irritated her still more and increased the rupture which was the cause of all their unhappiness. A natural impulse tempted him to disavow the blame and cast it at her, but a second and stronger impulse came to close the breach as quickly as possible and not let it grow wider. For him to remain under the shadow of an injustice was cruel, but, under the pretext of a justification, to cause her pain was still worse. Like a man half asleep, wearied with pain, he wished to free himself from it, to throw off the painful place, but, on fully waking, he found that the painful place was himself. Patience only was necessary to give relief to the pain, and he tried to apply this remedy. Reconciliation followed. Kitty felt herself in the wrong, and, though she did not confess it, was more than ever tender to him, and they felt a new and doubled happiness of love. But this did not prevent these differences from coming up, and coming up very frequently from the most unexpected and insignificant causes. These collisions often arose from the fact that they were still ignorant of what was indispensable for each, and from the fact that during all this first period they both were often in a bad frame of mind. When one was happy and the other depressed, then peace was disturbed, but when they both happened to be in low spirits, then such childish things were sufficient to provoke misunderstandings, that they could not even remember afterwards what they were quarrelling about. It is true, when they were both in good spirits, their joy of life was doubled. But nevertheless this first period was a trying time for them both. All those early days they felt with especial vividness the strain, just as if both of them were pulling in contrary ways on the chain that bound them. Especially the honeymoon, from which Levin expected so much, was far from honey-sweet, but remained in the memories of both of them the most trying and humiliating period of their lives. Both of them afterwards tried to blot from their memories all the ugly, shameful incidents of this unhealthy period, during which they so rarely found themselves in a normal state of mind, were so rarely themselves. Life became better regulated only after their return from Moscow, where they made a short visit in the 3rd month after the wedding. They were just back from Moscow and enjoying their solitude. Levin was sitting at his library table, writing. Kitty, dressed in a dark violet dress, which she had worn in the first days of their marriage, and which Levin had always liked, was making broderie anglaise, as she sat on the divan, on the great leather divan, which ever since the days of Levin's father and grandfather had stood in the library. Levin enjoyed her presence while he was writing and thinking. He had not abandoned his occupations, his farming, and the treatise in which the principles of his new method of conducting his estate were to be evolved. But, as before, these occupations and thoughts seemed to him small and useless in comparison with the gloom that overshadowed his life, so now they seemed just as petty and unimportant in comparison with the life before him, irradiated as it was with the full light of joy. He kept up his occupations, but felt now that the centre of gravity of his interests had shifted, and that consequently he looked otherwise and more clearly than formerly at the matter. In former days this occupation seemed like the salvation of his life. In former days he felt that without it life would be altogether gloomy. Now these occupations were necessary in order that his life might not be too monotonously bright. As he took up his manuscript again, reading over what he had written, he felt with satisfaction that the work was worth his attention. Many of his former thoughts seemed to him exaggerated and extravagant, but many of the gaps became clearly evident to him as he reviewed the whole subject. He was now writing a new chapter, in which he treated of the causes for the unfavorable condition of Russia's agriculture. He argued that the poverty of the country was caused not entirely by the unequal distribution of the land property and false economical tendencies, but that this cooperated with the abnormal introduction of a veneer of civilization, especially the means of communication, the railways, which produced an exaggerated centralization in the cities, the development of luxury, and consequently the creation of new industries at the expense of agriculture, an extraordinary extension of the credit system, and its concomitant stock speculation. It seemed to him that with a normal development of riches in the empire all these signs of exterior civilization would appear only when the cultivation of the land should have attained a proportional development, when it should have at least been established on correct, determining conditions, that the wealth of a country ought to increase at a regular ratio, and in such a way that agriculture should not be outstripped by other branches of wealth, that the means of intercommunication ought to be developed in conformity with the natural development of agriculture, and that in view of our improper use of the land, the railways, constructed not by reason of actual necessity, but from political motives, were premature, and instead of the cooperation which they were expected to give to agriculture, they arrested it by encouraging the spread of manufacturing and the credit system. And that, therefore, just as a one-sided and premature development of one organ in the body would prevent its general development, so for the general development of wealth in Russia, the credit system, the means of intercommunication, the recrudescence of manufacturing industries, however indispensable they may have been in Europe, where they are opportune, have in Russia done nothing but harm by keeping from sight the most important question as to the organization of agriculture. While Levin was writing, Kitty was thinking how her husband, on the evening before they left Moscow, had watched unnaturally the young Prince Tsarsky, who with remarkable lack of tact had made love to her. "He is jealous," she said to herself. "Bozhe moi, how good and stupid he is, to be jealous of me. If he only knew that for me they are all like Pyotr, the cook." And she glanced with a strange feeling of proprietorship at the back of her husband's head and sunburnt neck. "It is a shame to interrupt him, but he has plenty of time. I must see his face. Will he feel how I am looking at him? I will for him to turn around. There, I will make him." And she opened her eyes as wide as she could, as if to concentrate more strength into her gaze. "Yes, they attract all the best sap and give a false appearance of wealth," murmured Levin, ceasing to write and conscious that she was looking at him and smiling. He turned around. "What is it?" he asked, smiling and getting up. He did turn around, she thought. "Nothing, I only willed to make you turn around." And she looked at him as if to fathom whether he was vexed or not because she had disturbed him. "Well, how good it is to be alone together, for me at least," said he, radiant with joy, going to where she sat. "I am so happy here. I never, never want to go away again, especially not to Moscow." "But what were you thinking about?" I was thinking. No, go on with your writing. Don't let your mind be distracted," she replied, pouting. "I must cut all these eyelet holes now. Do you see?" And she took her scissors and began to snip. "No, tell me what you were thinking about," he insisted, sitting down near her and following all the movements of her little scissors. "Oh, what was I thinking about? About Moscow and the nape of your neck." "What have I done to deserve this great happiness? It is supernatural. It is too good," said he, kissing her hand. "To me, on the contrary, the happier I am, the more natural I find it." "You have a little stray curl," he said, turning her head around carefully. "A stray curl? Let it be. We must think about serious things." But their conference was interrupted, and, when Kuzma came to announce tea, they separated as if they were guilty. "Are they returned from town?" asked Levin of Kuzma. "They're just back. They're unpacking the things now." "Come as quickly as you can," said Kitty, going from the library. Levin, left alone, shut up his books and papers in a new portfolio, bought by his wife, washed his hands in a new wash basin, supplied with elegant new appurtenances, also bought by her, and, smiling at his thoughts, nodded his head disapprovingly. He was tormented by a feeling which resembled remorse. His life had become too indolent, too spoiled. It was a life of a Capuan, and he felt ashamed of it. "To live so is not good," he thought. "Here, for 3 months, I have scarcely done a thing. Today, almost for the first time, I have set about anything seriously, and what was the result? I have hardly begun before I give it up. I even neglect my ordinary occupations. I don't watch the men. I don't go anywhere. Sometimes I am sorry to leave her. Sometimes I see that she is out of spirits. I, who believed that existence before marriage counted for nothing, and that life only began after marriage. And here, for 3 months, I have been spending my time in absolute idleness. This must not go on. I must do something. Of course, she is not to blame, and one could not lay the least blame on her. But I ought to have shown more firmness and have preserved my manly independence. Otherwise, I shall get into confirmed bad habits. Of course, she's not to blame." A discontented man finds it hard not to blame someone or other for his discontent, and generally the very person who is nearest. And so Levin felt vaguely that while the fault was not his wife's, and he could not help lay it to her charge, it was owing to her bringing up. It was too superficial and frivolous. That fool of a Tsarsky, for example. I know she wanted to get rid of him, but she did not know how. Then he went on again. "Yes, besides the petty interest of housekeeping. She looks out for those and enjoys them. Besides her toilette and her broderie anglaise, she has no serious interests, no sympathy in my labours, in my schemes, or for the musics, no taste for reading or music, and yet she is a good musician. She does absolutely nothing, and yet she is perfectly content." Levin in his heart judged her thus, and did not comprehend that his wife was making ready for the time of activity which was ere long to come to her, when she would be at once wife, mistress of the house, mother, nurse, teacher. He did not understand that she knew this by intuition, and in preparation for this terrible task could not blame herself for these indolent moments and the enjoyment of love which made her so happy, while she was cheerily building her nest for the future. When Levin came upstairs again, his wife was sitting in front of the new silver samovar, behind the new tea set, reading a letter from Dolly, with whom she kept up a brisk correspondence. Old Agafya Mikhailovna, with a cup of tea, was cosily sitting at a small table beside her. "You see your lady has asked me to sit here," said the old woman, looking affectionately at Kitty. These last words showed Levin that the domestic drama which had been going on between Kitty and Agafya Mikhailovna was at an end. He saw that, notwithstanding the chagrin which Agafya Mikhailovna felt at resigning the reins of government to the new mistress, Kitty was victorious, and had just made peace with her. "Here, I have been looking over your letters," said Kitty, handing her husband an illiterate-looking envelope. "I think it is from that woman, you know, of your brother's. I have not read it, but this is from Dolly. Imagine it. She has been to take Grisha and Tanya to a children's ball at the Sarmatskys'. Tanya was dressed like a little marchioness." But Levin was not listening. With a flushed face he took the letter from Marya Nikolaevna, his brother Nikolai's discarded mistress, and began to read it. This was already the second time that she had written him. In her first letter she told him that Nikolai had sent her away without reason, and she added, with touching simplicity, that she asked no assistance and wanted nothing, though she was reduced to penury, but that the thought of what Nikolai Dmitritch would do without her in his feeble condition was killing her. She begged his brother to look out for him. Her second letter was in a different tone. She said that she had found Nikolai Dmitrievitch and was living with him again in Moscow, that she had gone with him to a provincial city where he had received an appointment. There they had quarreled with the chief and immediately started for Moscow. But on the way he had been taken so violently ill that he would probably never leave his bed again. "He constantly calls for you, and besides, we have no money," she wrote. "Read what Dolly writes about you," Kitty began. But when she saw her husband's dejected face, she suddenly stopped speaking. Then she said, "What is it? What has happened?" "She writes me that Nikolai, my brother, is dying. I must go to him." Kitty's face suddenly changed. The thought of Tanya as a little marchioness, of Dolly and all, vanquished. "When shall you go?" "Tomorrow." "May I go with you?" she asked. "Kitty, what an idea!" he replied reproachfully. "Why, what an idea!" she exclaimed, vexed to see her proposal received with such bad grace. "Why, pray, should I not go with you? I should not hinder you in any way. I am going because my brother is dying," said Levin. "Why should you go?" "For the same reason that you do." "At the same time so solemn for me, she thinks only of the discomfort of being left alone," said Levin to himself, and this excuse for taking part in such a solemn duty angered him. "It is impossible," he replied sternly. Agafya Mikhailovna, sensing that a quarrel was imminent, quietly put down her cup and went out. Kitty did not even notice it. Her husband's tone wounded her all the more deeply because he evidently did not believe what she said. "I tell you, if you go, I am going too. I shall certainly go with you. I certainly am going," said she, with angry determination. "Why is it impossible? Why did you say that?" "Because God knows when, or in what place I shall find him, or by what means I shall reach him. You would only hinder me," said he, doing his best to retain his self-control. "Not at all. I don't need anything. Where you can go, I can go too, and—" "Well, if it were nothing else, it would be because of that woman, with whom you cannot come in contact." "Why not? I know nothing about all that, and don't want to know. I know that my husband's brother is dying, and that my husband is going to see him, and I am going too, because—" "Kitty, don't be angry. And remember that in such a serious time it is painful for me to have you add to my grief by showing such weakness. The fear of being alone. There now, if it would bore you to be alone, go to Moscow." "You always ascribe to me such miserable sentiments," she cried, choking with tears of vexation and anger. "I am not so weak. I know that it is my duty to be with my husband when he is in sorrow, and you want to wound me on purpose. You don't want to take me."
"No, this is frightful, to be such a slave," cried Levin,
rising from the table, no longer able to hide his anger. At the same instant he perceived that he was doing himself harm. "Why then did you get married? You might have been free. Why, if you repent already—" and Kitty fled into the drawing-room. When he went to find her, she was sobbing. He began to speak, striving to find words not to persuade her, but to calm her. She would not listen, and did not allow one of his arguments. He bent over her, took one of her recalcitrant hands, kissed it, kissed her hair, and then her hands again, but still she refused to speak. But when, at length, he took her head between his two hands and called her "Kitty," she softly wept, and the reconciliation was complete. It was decided that they should go together on the next day. Levin told his wife he was satisfied that she wished nothing but to be useful, and agreed that Marya Nikolaevna's presence with his brother would not be an impropriety. But at the bottom of his heart he was dissatisfied with himself and with her. He was dissatisfied with her because she would not let him go alone when it was necessary. And how strange it was for him to think that he who such a short time before had not dared to believe in the possibility of such joy as her loving him, now felt unhappiness because she loved him too well. And he was dissatisfied with himself because he had yielded in such a weak way. In the depths of his heart he was even more dissatisfied to think of the inevitable acquaintance between his wife and his brother's mistress. The thought of seeing his wife, his Kitty, in the same room with this woman, filled him with horror and repulsion.